to keep this conversation a bit more focused, I want to focus on how private sector can play a role and what type of data we can collect from them to really make a difference, right? And obviously from our perspective to female labor force participation, but also from their perspective as employers, as organizations, how can they really use this data to drive better business outcomes? So I think that's all I wanted to say to set up. Now, Yamini, you're sort of president at the Udaiti Foundation. Your vision is to increase women's economic empowerment, really help women achieve their economic potential. And also, I know from your experience at Gates and all of the conversations we've had that data is something that's super, super important to you. So can you just give us all a bit of a landscape of existing data around women's economic empowerment and especially some of the gaps that you see that can be filled by the private sector?
Thanks so much, Sowjanya, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm dying to respond to your opening remarks, but I'll hold them for later. I think the women's economic empowerment landscape, data landscape is no different from any other in that it's deeply fragmented, there's lots of gaps, there's lots of measurement questions. At the same time, data is not enough, right? To the extent that to make solid decisions and the kind of actions we want to take, data is one input, data and evidence. And when I say data, it also means evidence generation. So it's not just hard numbers, but also assessments, evaluations, really making sense of what's going on. And so I think with that sort of overall statement that it's fragmented, it's imperfect, I'll say that the particular challenges of the women's economic empowerment landscape is women's economic empowerment is a buzzword. Everyone has different approaches to it. At the same time, we want it to reflect everything for all women. And so I think, the first sort of hypothesis I'll say is that some of the challenges are also in our lens. We don't necessarily go and say, I want to understand a male agri-entrepreneur in, like, say, Gadchiroli, and the CEO of NASCOM from the same survey. But we want to understand all women from a single source. I think I'll sort of lay that out as an expectation challenge that we have, in that we want something to tell us everything about all women and therefore inform all action. And so this problem of data, the data ecosystem being fragmented is both a strength as well as a limitation. Now, with that, I'll say we also know that I think nearly, 80% of, say, the SDG indicators for gender don't have any data sources. So there is that second issue that there is a data gap that's very, very real. In terms of the Indian data landscape, I think, we have a pretty unique statistical system from the government side. There's frequent surveys. There's, there have been, multiple rounds of surveys that allow you to look at comparability, that allow you to look at trends, change over time. You mentioned the National Family Health Survey. We know the Periodic Labor Force Survey. They all have certain measurement sort of frameworks that they work with. Now, how does a government, for the size of the country, change those things I think that's a second question that we'll have to come to, discussion more later on. But at least suffice to say we have data on specific parameters. For example, on employment, on financial inclusion, on digital access, but these are all very, very output kind of data. Now, the so what of what's happening in the country, the kinds of action we want, will not come from these large data sets alone, right? And so that's where we have to sort of then get into what does the landscape look like when we move away from these large data sets. One big question that has come up in the last few years is women's unpaid care work, right? So when we look at women's economic empowerment, we're looking at employment, entrepreneurship, all of those things, but we also have a whole theory or a framing around the enablers of women's empowerment as well as women's economic participation, the ability to make choices, the ability to access opportunities, to shape them. And in that, I think unpaid care is, India has, all of you know this, I don't need to restated, but India has one of the worst ratios in terms of women to men hours spent on unpaid care work. And so how do we know that? We logically understand it because it's not it cuts across class, but at the same time, it's laudable that the government has invested in a large time use survey. Now, how have we used it is the question, right? So data is as good as its use. So, as you said, what gets measured gets changed, but actually what gets used is actually the starting point of the change that we want to see. So unless we start using that data, we're not actually, addressing the kinds of questions at least what data exists. Now, what data doesn't exist, there's a whole plethora. Mobility, financial inclusion is not just about bank accounts, right? It's about a whole host of financial parameters that matter to women. Do we really have that understanding? We don't have that understanding about men or women. A lot of data that exists with the government system takes a head of household sort of lens, and therefore we have something about the household. There are a few modules here and there that talk about women, and I think that's increasing, and that's a welcome thing, and we should definitely support the expansion and the scaling of. Now, additionally, you have a lot of administrative data, and I think in the last several years, we've all gotten better about using administrative data to understand the more process-level outcomes. But that also has its own limitations. There are no denominators. You sort of say, okay, so many women, you have numbers, right? And so that's not really telling you a story, but we're getting better about how to use that. The third sort of bucket is, of course, as you talked about, like private sector. Now, do we have good private sector data? I don't know. Everyone here in this room is with the private sector. I'd say no. I think the gender data coming from the private sector is by far one of the worst. I mean, so we have actually a plethora of data on one hand where we may have some challenges by way of representativeness or actionability or frequency, but on the other hand, we have a lot of private sector data that gets collected but is not available in public. So I think the first thing, if you have a call to action for the private sector, collect gender disaggregated data. Understand in your designs, in your baselining that, or in your metrics that households are not all women, and therefore, whether it's designing financial products or designing policies for companies, there is a differentiation one needs to bring. And second, whatever you collect, publish it, because there's a lot of people waiting to learn and wanting to actually analyze and understand and improve things. So that's the second piece. The third sort of big message is, I think there's a lot of metadata. So tech for good, I mean, there's so much metadata that's being collected. I think everyone's running to understand, rural behavior, consumer behavior, how can we shape it, how can we inform it? Is that granular enough, and can it be also be used by, the non-profit sector? Can it be used to actually inform policy rather than just product utilization? Now, that can only happen when it is public, right? And you can have your blinders. You have to blind a lot of the sensitive data, and I think the discussions around data privacy are very, very live right now, rightfully so. But is there a way that one can actually start to think about a way that one can access and use, inform it and actually use it for the kinds of outcomes of interest that we have for poor women, right? And the last thing I'll say is this whole question of, okay, how does that data get reported and how does it get used? One could, of course, have regulatory mechanisms. One could say, SEBI has mandated reporting of gender data from the publicly listed companies. Udaiti is very interested in this kind of mechanism because it's important to start tracking where we can. On the other hand, there's also, a lofty sort of legacy building that private sector can do in being more proactive and in self-reporting and in actually making this public. And I think that self-reflection and that journey, I mean, Suman is sitting next to me, so I know you'll talk about it, but that journey of wanting to improve. So using data not just to prove, oh, we did so well, look at our last year's annual report, we were fantastic, and here's what we did, as opposed to using data to sort of reflect and say, okay, what were our gaps and how can we use data to improve not just ourselves, but also the sector as a whole. So I think that shift in our own minds that data is not just about accountability, of course, but it's also about improving things. And that can only happen when you make it public, when there's a set of stakeholders we believe in who are interested, who can partner in that sense making. And I guess the last thing I'll say is the means versus outcomes piece, right? I think all of us are very interested in the so what of it in terms of outcomes. But I think a lot of lessons in every sector has told us that the means are as important as the ends. And therefore, how do we understand those means? There is strategy, there is process, there's documentation, there's experts who come in, talk, there's practitioners who come in and talk, leaders who've set up some of these interesting policies reflect, but data can be a real friend there. And so how do we think of ways to set up interesting, lean as well as smart data systems that can actually even give you the kind of feedback on something even as it's unfolding. And so both impact at the end, but also impact along the way in terms of how people feel about a program. Is it working well? Is it really inclusive? Is it just addressing a creamy layer of employees? I mean, all of these are questions that we have to be really attuned to, and therefore we have to, we can make data our friend in sort of answering and giving us feedback so that we can, actually continuously improve. So I'll stop there with those opening remarks.
Thank you, Yamini. I mean, I think you made a bunch of very, very, very relevant points. I think especially around not just collecting data. Sometimes data exists and we just don't know what to do with it, or we don't use it, right? But actually using that data for change, but also like thinking about responsible and ethical collection, management, and really figuring out how that data can be best used. So I think with that, Shaveta, I'd love to come to you. You're managing director and CEO at Central Square Foundation. CSF's vision is really around creating quality learning for all children and really leveraging government systems to do that. I know that you've been really working on the agenda of foundational literacy and numeracy, and that's been an effort that did heavily rely on data to really, first create that awareness, and then now also figure out what it is that can be used as a solution, right? So I'd love to hear, based on some of the things that Yamini said, and I know you've also been an early mentor for Act for Women, so I know you also bring that lens as well. So what are some of the lessons that we can really learn from the education sector when it comes to really using data responsibly, well, and not just collecting it?
Sure, thanks. We always want to look at life in absolute terms, but it becomes more relative. And if we are talking on the women economic empowerment data, then education definitely looks, we are much ahead of the journey. We are much better. We seem to have solved it. That's not the complete truth. So let me start with that caveat, that education is relatively much better, but we still have miles to go in that journey. And the journey actually at a sector level started with when ASR first published its report. I think most of you are familiar with the report. They come on learning outcomes. It's a rural household-based survey. They first came out with it in 2005 with the simple agenda, let's shine the spotlight that there is a problem that exists. Like, I think most of us would anecdotally know that government schools mein padhai theek nahi ho raha. Our staff would much rather pull the child out, put them in a low-fee private school. But systematically at a sector level, and I think it takes a lot of gumption and bravery to say, I'll shine the spotlight on a problem at a national level. The biggest learning from ASR is that let not the ideal be an enemy of what we need. You know, there are research papers which will talk about how learning should actually be measured and the nth level of refinement. And I'm a big believer in the value of that. But at what stage of the journey, what metric do we need? ASR is a very simple tool. It had to be simple because it's rural, household-based. They employ volunteers. It's almost done like in a mission mode. But there is unanimous anticipation and agreement in those results. Even in government offices, I have my government data, but everyone is waiting for their ASR state report. All government people are looking at that data because it's done in a volunteer household-based, and that's what makes it reliable. So while the tool might not be the most sophisticated, it's reliable data. So I mean, the two main points I think we can take from ASR, which deserves a lot of credit, and to be honest, whether it's CSF or the collective salience of foundational literacy and numeracy, has stood on the shoulders of the fact that Asar's been telling us this since 2005. Don't let ideal be the enemy of good, right? Have a minimum viable product and start with it and refine it. And second most important is the reliability of the data. And I think that's where incentives need to be set in place. Unfortunately, I think as I'm growing, I'm realizing how conformist we are as people and society and as a country. So the same compulsion shows up in data, right? Anytime anyone is asking me for data, my standard assumption is that you'll judge me based on the data I show you. It'll either lead to punitive action or a judgment. And hence the incentive is to make it look better, right? Like I'll want to give you a cut which makes it look relatively better than what the reality is. So anytime we are talking data, right? Even for the private sector to start publishing DEI data, I recently learned a new term that it's now becoming DEIB, where we are adding belongingness. Very curious to see how we'll start measuring that. But what is the incentive? And if the incentive is that the data will be used for better actioning, that's the only way we'll get people to be more honest, right? I'll pick up a controversial, but we all know the example. If the Swachh Bharat mission data is only getting collected to declare victory, then we know that that data is not representative of the reality. So how do we align incentives? And that, by the way, is standard, right? And I'm deliberately starting from the private sector and not necessarily the government sector, because incentives would be, all of us want to look good, right? All of us want to look better than might the reality be, because we've been raised to believe that data is either punitive or celebratory, most basically judgmental. In education, what's the most publicly available data in education is 10th board exams, 10th and 12th and college cutoffs. Anytime you read data on education in newspaper, those are the metrics which get highlighted. Is that enough, right? What is the level of sophistication we need for it to actually be usable from an action perspective? So for example, and without making it very technical, the foundational literacy and numeracy, the early learning journey, for the first time, the government is defining learning in terms of competencies. I think most people in this room are a product of where we were judged on a textbook khatam ho gaya, exam ho gaya, or percentage aa gaya, whether or not you learned was like secondary or tertiary. But now it's the conversation is on competencies. And for the first time ever, NCERT and Ministry of Education partnered to conduct a benchmarking study in India. It's called the Foundational Learning Study, that what are the learning metrics by language. And it's been, so I'm just contrasting it from the first ASAR came in 2005, to we got a new education policy in 2020, to an early learning mission in 21. And in 22 is when that benchmarking study got published. But so it requires relentless focus to unpack, peel the onion, go to the next layer, and be consistent in that. I mean, I think especially for the V agenda, and I mean, whether it's the work at Udaiti or Act for Women, we have to make a starting point, but know that it needs to be further refined. And hence, the simple message is, what is the metric, what is the frequency, and how can that get refined over time? The last point I'll make is, and I think most of us in any presentation would have often said about data-based decision-making. It's almost like, should we be honest? Should we collaborate? Yes and yes. Should we use data for decision-making? Of course, yes. But is the data that we are collecting lending itself to decision-making, right? I mean, there's no harm in having some data which just make good optics in an annual report, because we're talking private sector, why not? An annual report is meant to, Yamini, to your point, right? Like, it's okay to give good news. But behind that, is there honest data which actually peels it down for what is that metric for women at different levels in the organization? What is that metric in different cities? What is that metric in different sectors? What is that metric in different industries? I think data-based decision-making doesn't happen because we come up with that idea and we say we'll take up all this data and start making decisions. That thought has to go into what data, what metric, what frequency, and are we willing to ask uncomfortable questions? We stop at the first level because that data might make me look average to okay, but I know that when I start asking harder questions, whether I'm a corporate, whether I'm an NGO, whether I'm a sector, is when some of the insufficiencies or deficiencies will show up. And I think having comfort with that needs to become very important. because otherwise, we'll always be in a celebratory mode. One of our concerns in our early learning work is that because there's focus, because there's data collection, there will be the urge to declare premature victory. And then you can start showing data, which starts showing improvement, which might not be the reality on the ground. And I think specifically when in the private sector, data sets become more comparable because they get put out in the public domain, that pressure from a market recognition perspective, I think would be something to watch out for. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaveta. I think both from what Yamini was talking about in terms of the fact that a lot of times the data exists, and also how do we publicly share it, how do we create some of these common frameworks, which again don't have to be perfect to start with, but at least once we start seeing what it looks like, we can obviously refine that. And I think to your point, I really like one of the points you made about like looking at 10th, 12th marks versus looking at actual learning outcomes, right? So like an output versus outcome, so that we really define those metrics correctly as well. But no, I think there's a lot to learn. I know you've said you still have a long way to go, but I think just given where we are, and one of the things you didn't mention, but the year sort of put it out there, is that it is a long journey, right? Like if Asar started in 2005 and 2020 is when we started seeing some results, I think we also all need to be in this for the long haul. So yeah, I think just segueing from that, one of the things we're doing at Act for Women, and which is why this panel is almost like a mini research piece for me, it's not even just a panel discussion, is that we're trying to figure out what does this data framework look like for the private sector that we can start sharing, right? So with the Udaiti Foundation, we are running the study called the Women in Startups Ecosystem Report. It's the first study on gender diversity in startups. I think to Yamini's point as well, trying to be a little specific in the segment we're looking at, right? Rather than looking at women as a whole, trying to start somewhere. But with that, I do want to come to Shreyasi, Apurva, and Suman, who do bring a lot of this sort of private sector angle in very different respects, actually. So, Shreyasi, I'll start with you. Harappa recently published the Women at Workplace report, and that, I think, is one of the largest studies that India has seen, where almost 1,000 women were interviewed and really tried to understand what are their aspirations and motivations from their employers, right? And the question that I had for you, Shreyasi, is what is it that employers need to start looking at, right? Like when they're talking to their employees, like how do they identify some of these outcomes? How do they really listen and get that data from their employees? But any thoughts you can share on that?
So I think, being in the private sector, actually I feel employers have an immense opportunity for social change. I think employers are really, the private sector is really an educator and a lifelong educator, especially when there are broken education systems and you come into the workforce at 21 and you're going to learn new skills to 65. I really feel like, private sector and employers have to think of themselves as educators as well as social catalysts, because I do think that in some pockets of the private sector and employment, women are starting to actually get much more equity than at home, right? And I think our workplaces, some enlightened organizations, the workplaces are actually much more equal than home, where the roles are still more gendered. And I think to Yamini's point, I think you have to be specific about the data that you have, right? So at Harappa, because we're a learning institution, we have lots of programming for women's leadership. We said we constantly need to understand what's going on. And I think a lot of the data, whether what CSF does or what Yamini was talking about, is rights-based, equity-based, data collection, access to education. And I think all of that is important, of course, to set the right soil. But I think to really change things, you do need to also do asset-based conversations where women are concerned. And I think asset-based conversations where women are concerned is really seeing positions of power, accelerated growth, high growth careers, role models of success. I mean, I don't think that and in fact, India is doing pretty well on education from an access perspective. Even in higher education, many more women graduates, even in engineers, right? relative to where relative to where we started. But actually, but actually in workforce participation, formal workforce participation, we're actually doing worse year on year. And that to me is like you're losing all of the effort and progress that you've made, because eventually for 30, 40 years, the fact is that the financial, financial prowess or financial self-sufficiency is always going to be an important metric of success, right? So we started to see that, and I actually think we don't do enough with the data we all have. I think there is enough data to take action for most of us. So I make it really simple the report, and you guys have seen the report, is to say, first, I feel data and storytelling data has to be a little provocative and has to be, we should have obviously full-fledged research data that researchers will exchange between themselves and know how to make sense of. And of course, that data rigor must be there. But if you want data to be used for whether individual decision-making, or you want data to be used for, changing the environment around us, whether it's our companies, whether it's our teams, whether it's our homes, whether it's our colleges, like at that micro level is where change happens. You have to urge action, and you have to be a little provocative with the storytelling. So my first sort of input to all research teams is you need to get a copywriter and a storyteller because I do feel like we're not angry enough about the data that we have, and because there's so much to be angry about, and not action oriented, because not everybody, I think you have to think like a mass marketer when you have large data sets and almost have that team. For employers, at least what we have found this is one of sort of India's largest data sets on working women in companies, right? And I say three things. First, I call it the unforgivable sin, which is sort of where the copy writing is coming, is to say that the widest gender pay gap is not at entry level. The widest gender pay gap in corporate India is CXO -1. The 74 paisa to 100. And I'm like, how much more do you want us to prove that we're equal? When you feel like you've beyond the glass ceiling, when you sort of battled and bruised on the other side, also you find out that you're making 25% less. So one tip to all employers or anyone working in any company, please go to your CHRO or whoever and say, hey, what's the gender pay gap data at the CXO? Because then what do you aspire for? That after 25, 30 years of work, you're sort of confronted with your widest pay gap. So I think that's one. So please, whoever has access to that kind of data or can muster up the courage to have kind of an urge for people to share. Like I share it at Harappa. We're a small company, but I share designation-wise gender data. And the fact is you're not going to be perfect at every level, but you're saying, hey, we're good in 4 out of 6, and I think we can all start sharing that. The second thing that we've seen a strong correlation to is women don't have P&L roles in middle management. If I was in charge of any team, like push people, like, any high potential woman can influence, are in charge of, you have to get them to take on P&L roles, and they don't have to do it all their lives if they hate it, but they must do it for 2 years, right? So I think because they need that on their CVs from an acceleration. So that's the second thing for sure. And last, this is again sort of to be provocative, I call, women's professional careers like the greatest obstacle course in history. It's like, Indiana Jones, you're walking through like swamps with snake pits, and then you go into a rickety Amazonian bridge. Because it's called, there's a broken rung from 28 to 35 years old, right? And then there's the glass ceiling, which and now there's the glass cliff. There are record number of senior women leaving, which is just terrible for, employers who've actually invested, but what is happening at that stage? So I think if you start looking at, your workforce or whoever you have, data access to, what's happening at the broken run, 28 to 35, what's happening at the glass ceiling, and worse when you've got people there to have them leave, 2 times more senior most women are leaving the workforce than senior most men. So I think those are things that actually one can start to change quite quickly, and I don't think it should be so tough to do well.
No, I think I think the Harappa report and some of the other things that we've been talking about, they do raise some very specific action points that we hope that companies can actually start, right? Like we would love to have a starting point somewhere, because often I feel like it seems like such a big problem to solve that it's just rather like, let's not look at this at all. So yeah, I think the 2-3 points that you've mentioned are super relevant and super actionable for organizations to even have a starting point. Apurva, I know you lead startups and VC at Google, and I know that supporting women entrepreneurs and getting more female founders and setting them up for success has been a big agenda item for Google and recently. So Shreyasi, I think, has spoken about it more from an employment and what can we do to really empower women as employees in organizations. From your, and I know you published a recent research report as well, but what's your perspective on the other side, right? Like there's obviously a bottom-up way of getting more women in, and then there's also a top-down, because we've seen enough research that says that more women founders means more women in the workforce as well. So how do you see that pyramid going?
We went to college together, and I've always, enjoyed listening to your views. When we started looking at this whole thesis that we are not really adequately leveraging the power of women in the startup and VC ecosystem, I want to add VC ecosystem as well, because any guesses on what percentage of partners in VC firms are women in India? 930 firms. Yeah. No. That's 100% more. Less than 1.5% partners are women. So, and it's a flywheel. So we can't talk about women entrepreneurs without talking about women investors. So we have to understand the way the flywheel works. And we said something very simple. We said, it's better to have a weak candle than operate in dark. And yeah, one day there will be light and all of us will be amazed with the quality of data. But let's start with a weak candle and let's start moving. So classical startup style, let's start hustling. Let's start moving the ball towards the goalpost. And the other thesis was, you don't need a massive consulting report to prove the night is black. We know there is a challenge. So why don't we start moving the ball towards the goalpost? So with that, we started working on just 3-4 hypotheses. And we said, when you talk to investors, when you talk to founders, everybody says, hey, we understand there's a problem. We understand women can be great startup execs, but show me the talent. Where's the talent? We don't have a pipeline. We don't have women founders we can invest in. So we just did a small data pack. We pulled out LinkedIn. We pulled out the funding data from Traction, and we quickly started creating cuts, small SQL queries to start creating cuts. And we realized that the probability of a woman founder creating a unicorn is the same as a male founder. 0.5 percentage point difference. The probability of a woman raising money is the same as the probability of a male founder raising money. Everything is the same. The outcomes are different because very few women are entering at the bottom of the funnel or the top of the funnel, depending on where you. So the biggest problem, the choke point, is not enough women entering the workforce in startups. This is only for startups. VCs is a different problem. So we said, wow, we must be wrong. The answer can't be so simple. So we became really convinced that we are wrong. And we started trying to disprove the hypothesis. Eventually, after 3-4 months, we realized after trying everything that hypothesis is right. So we published a report which we actually, to use Shreyasi's point, and I think both of us were trained in advertising. So we said, it's a myth-busting report. So 10 myths on women founders which you should bust. So every time you say women can't build in deep tech, this is a myth, and here is the data which proves that in India, women are building in deep tech. Women can't create unicorns. Here is the data which shows men are creating, in terms of percentage, it's exactly the same. Every time you say women get underfunded, well, the data doesn't show that. It's hard data from MCA. So we created a myth-busting report. Now, when you talk about the top, and you mentioned bottom and top, I think what we can do at top is like we never start hiring till 50% of the slate is women candidates. Does it lead to a longer hiring cycle? Yes. Is it worth? Absolutely. So we can be very, very deliberate, and to just make it easy for founders and investors, what we want to now do is create a playbook. So let's not leave it for people to figure out what they can do, but create like one-page pullouts, which you can just tick, put it as a screensaver, which exactly tells you what should you do to move the needle. Very simple, 3 points, 4 points. The third thing is, let's not make it a social argument. The number one fiduciary responsibility of investors and founders who raise money is to return the money. So if we make it a social argument, we are not going to cut a lot of ice. People will give us a listening, but affirmative action might not happen. And there is brilliant economic data. Some of it is in the report. This is the economic argument and not only a social argument. And the moment we shift the needle to economic argument, we will not only start getting heart share all of us understand is the right thing to do. We will start getting wallet share. And the moment we start getting wallet share, we'll start getting market share. Thank you.
I love some of the examples that everyone actually has spoken about in terms of like actually using some very specific data points to land a message and then also create recommendations around that, right? I think, and that's really, I think, the power of data that we're really trying to talk about. And I mean, I think the one takeaway I'd love everyone to have at this room is whatever level you're at, whether it's just starting to look at gender disaggregated data, whether it's going to see peeling the next layer of that onion to go beyond that initial findings and insights, I think a lot of useful lessons already. Now, Suman, as the sort of sole representative from an organization that has been using data to really go on this journey, I think a lot of like perspectives have been thrown at you. Now, would just love your response on all of this.
Sure. First and foremost, I am a CHRO and I publish pay equity data. So I'll just talk a little bit about our journey, right? So I work in this company called Freshworks, startup. When I joined Freshworks, I joined at a CXO level, right? But when I looked at the organization, nobody above a manager level was a woman, right? Everybody, senior manager, director, senior director, vice president, CXO, board members, all male. I was the sole woman that sat in that. But overall, aggregate, if you looked at the data, we actually did pretty well. We were above industry standards because we were hiring a lot more women at the entry level, right? And so, depends also on how you look at data. If we had to report aggregate data, we were doing very well. But when I joined, a number of the women were very excited. So they came to me and they said, hey, it's very nice to have you. You know, you are a role model. We'd love to know what it takes, all of that stuff, right? Fair. So we had a really nice conversation, all of that. Then come Women's Day, I was asked to make a post. I said, sorry. As the token woman, I am not making any post. So I told our CEO, I said, if you truly believe, you should make a post. So he said, okay, what do you want me to say? He said, okay, what is our data? So I said, here is our data. He said, overall aggregate, we are at 25%. Okay? He said, is that good, bad, or ugly? I said, it's decent. I mean, there's nothing to write home about. It's decent. It's not terrible, it's decent. He said, then what? I said, look at, manager and above. Other than me, it's like 0. I said, okay. So what should it be? I said, great question. What should it be? I said, anything less than 50%, you really have nothing to talk home about. Why is 30% good? Why is 40% good? Right? Unless it's 50%, there's no claim to fame. Right? You might be better than others, but just because everybody else is equally bad doesn't make you good. Right? And so this is our CEO, decides to make a public pledge. And he says, we will work towards equality. across the organization, we will have 50% women. I said, fabulous. Now here comes the power of data and measurement. So as good or bad your data might be, the minute you start measuring it, there is a motivation that kicks in to do better, right? And I think that's the biggest way to look at data with. Otherwise, like 25% is decent, right? But why is it decent? Why do you settle for decent? So that was the first thing. So we said, let's start measuring. 2, you have to drive accountability. Now he and I can have a pact and say, okay, fine, we'll drive towards equality. But he went and put it on Twitter, LinkedIn, everywhere. And now promptly every 8th of March, I get people tweeting saying, do you have an update? Right? So there is a certain form of accountability that data drives. And I'll tell you, since that day, right, it was like 0 women on top. We have 3 board members who are women, including our lead board member, lead independent board member is a woman. In our CXO team, we have, it used to be about 50%. Now with more folks being added on, we are 33%. We are 3 women on the leadership team. We've moved the needle from almost 0 to about 25% in our leadership team being all women. Now it's progress. In 3 years, doing all of this, I think is progress. It's not victory, but it's definitely progress. And that's what makes people look up and say, I see role models now, I aspire to be. And the biggest thing it does is it's a conversation changer, right? In the room, you find that the tone and tenor of the conversation completely changes, right? And that is truly what inspired us to think about, why can't we do this across other organizations, right? The thing that we found is startup is a great place to innovate. Like one of the things, like you talked about, right? It's a leaky bucket. We all hire 50+% at entry level. But by the time it reaches manager level, it keeps falling off, right? So there is a huge leaky bucket. So what do? You have to fix the leaky bucket. And we make it incredibly hard for women to come back. So we said, okay, at my company, we have a returnship program. So we have lots of folks coming back in through the returnship program, right? We have things that we work with our high potential women to fast track. So you've got to find ways to do this so you're able to address some of the systemic issues. So data helps you really look at, in aggregate, are you doing okay? Are you making progress? But where specifically do you have issues and how can you innovate to drive, the relevant thing? And then when we started looking more at a, sector level data, country level data, it all seems so bleak. And then you show the bleak data, everybody starts questioning data, right? It cannot be true. Look at this room, we have so many women. How can it be that you have less than, 20% of women participate? All of that happens all the time, right? So I do think having definitive data certainly helps so we can stop spending time just arguing about the data, but really thinking about what do we need to do to make progress, right? Any progress in the right direction is good progress. And if we keep at it, I know we can do better as well. And I think that's the biggest reason we're also partnering with Udaiti to do Wiser, because our hope is that we can actually innovate in this space, at least within the VC startup ecosystem, and have learnings that can span across entire corporate India as well.
Thank you, Suman. I think when you talk about it, it also really brings to life some of the actual conversations that happen when we are trying to talk about all of these topics as well, right? So thank you for that. Now, before I sort of open it up to the audience, I know we have Vivek here from McKinsey. Hi, Vivek. Now Vivek has been sort of one of our partners on this entire Women in Startup Ecosystem report study as well. And I know, Vivek, I'd love to have you join us because I have a question for you specifically. So I know that you've constantly been sort of pushing us to, again, like I think Shaveta was saying, peel back the layers to really look beyond the data, to really identify what are those root core human insights, right? And One of the things before I open up to the roundtables to both ask questions and think about some of the enablers is what are some of the challenges, right? Like why are organizations not looking at this data? Why are they not prioritizing gender equity already, right? Like what are some of the things that come in the way is something I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
That's a great question. I'll preface my answer with one of my roles at McKinsey was also the advancement of women inside the firm. And very quickly you realize the problem is not helping women with the courage to power through it, but with a lot of the men who are sitting at the top. And so we had to change a lot of our mindsets and attitudes about and by the way, women refused to join the initiative. They said, I don't want to be part of something that seems like we're tilting the tables. Despite the fact that tables have been tilted the other way, even evening the tables felt like just too big an ask. I'll just say three things briefly. We could have a whole day on this, but number one, I think we're guilty of this as well. Making a economic argument, like as Apurva said, it can be quite seductive to say we're losing so many jobs or we're losing a number of, a huge part of the GDP is being lost out. But the reality is this is a social issue. I think when we make it an economic issue, the first root issue is that somebody gets up and says, are you telling me by hiring more women, my company is going to produce more profits? And nobody said that. And actually, if you hang your hat on that, you're done. Because I could make the same argument and say, in a nursing staff, if you told me you hired you turn nursing staff into half men, you start making more profit? No, you wouldn't. It's actually a failed argument entirely. So actually, the economic argument often works against us because then people say, if that's the case, prove it to me. We cannot prove it. Don't get me wrong. We have plenty of research that talks about the value of diversity, the value of gender equity. We talk about that. But actually, I do think there's an economic trap. It's a bit like the merit trap. There's an economic trap. So the first thing to realize, avoid the arguments. Just make the argument simply. There are a bunch of people who deserve to work alongside, occupy the same roles as men do. Nothing stops them from doing that, except structural issues with the roles and the jobs. The second is roles of influence. We studied, and we've done this work with another foundation, to try to understand what roles people have to take typically to become CEOs, and eventually even successful board members having had long executive careers. And if you look at that data, what it tells you is, even in organizations where you have, as you rightly said, it could be 20%, 30%, 50%, it's the wrong debate. It's actually the wrong debate altogether. It's the wrong conversation. The reality is the roles of influence are often not the roles in IT or in finance or 3 levels down in HR. Certainly the CHR role is a very heavy role of influence. But a lot of the roles of influence are sitting in operations, they're sitting in sales, they're sitting in research. They're sitting in places where, for some structural reason, people have decided it's easier to get the numbers up having people occupy functional roles as opposed to true line roles. That's the second insight. And I think organizations that crack the code on line roles figure out how to structure line roles in ways where women, their obligations to family, the natural birth cycle of childbirth, caregiving, does not come in the way of the role. That's going to happen. But they structure the roles in a way that you don't. And I gave you plenty of examples where I have heads of sales who actually don't travel as much. They manage differently. And they've actually restructured roles to do that. So those are roles of influence. And we need more women in roles of influence. And we should not let ourselves off the hook by looking at numbers overall, because I think averages lie. Right? The third thing we found, and I was sharing this with you, is that there were a few outlier institutions where there were women in roles of influence. So we said, wow, this is fantastic. What can we learn from them? So we dug deeper. And we found in most of those institutions, they were related to the promoter. which actually in some sense gave us hope. We said where there's a will, there's a way. And even though that will might be seen as some form of, nepotism would be the wrong thing. This is apprenticeship. I'm going to make my daughter, my niece, my cousin successful. To be successful, they're going to occupy roles of influence. I'm going to figure out how to change those roles so they don't fail in them. I could look at that as a very quickly relegate to nepotism, but that's actually not the insight. The insight is if there's sufficient will to make it work, people do. And so I'm sort of happy we found that, because at first the team looked at that and said, oh gosh, we have to discount it. And I said, no, don't discount it. Find out what they're doing with the roles to make it work for people they are committed to apprenticing and sponsoring. So anyway, let me stop there. I know there's lots we'll end up doing with all of you, but thank you for having me, and thank you for the panel. Learned a lot.
Thank you, Vivek. I think before we get into discussions, I'd love if there are maybe one or two questions that anyone has for anyone who's just spoken on the panel.
Hi, great panel. I'm Prashant from Unilever, and so good to see two marketeers as well, or on stage. I think a lot of data personally I've seen is just used to support your own confirmation bias, right? So just a personal question for all of you, is there been any data point you have seen which strikes out where you've had to question your own or your organization's confirmation bias?
So can organizations do anything to shift caregiving norms at home? Because if I've been conditioned for a good part of my life to have, heads up an advantage and do 7 times less caregiving work, so why will I ever give up, that advantage?
A lot of interesting conversation and discussion. I think my one question was, as we're looking at increasing women's labor force participation, and maybe more, Suman, to you, how much are we even changing the expectation? In some way, something that Vivek was talking about, right? Changing how the woman's role is structured in the organization to enable them to continue working. Because at least my experience has been, as you go up, part of the challenge is that it does take a lot more, but you do have another aspect of your life. And I'm fortunate to have worked in organizations where I've been able to straddle that, but I'm also curious to know how much of that is part of the conversations and discussions at organizations as we're talking about making more women in leadership roles or other positions.
Sure. Because of a recency bias, let's take her question first. And because my memory is failing me, and then we'll take all the questions. Otherwise, I think we won't do justice to them. I think if there was one quote-unquote good outcome of COVID, it was the fact that it really showed the fact that you can be successful working from anywhere, right? Because prior to that, most often, it would be women who had caregiving responsibilities who would ask for remote work, flexible work. Very rarely you have men asking for that, right? And it kind of became a little delicate saying, would it be okay to do it? Would you treat somebody differently if you had to make all these concessions? All that has gone away, right? So that's one. I think that in itself has become a par for course thing to do for organizations now. So when people ask for flexible working arrangements, caregiving, remote work, trailing spouses always had it very, very difficult, and usually it would be the woman who's the trailing spouse, and they would have to give up work. All that, I think, is changing, right? But to your point on different ways of working, yes, organizations have to shed some of the, what should I say, traditional mindset that they have of, this is how the work has to be done, or this is the way of managing. One of the ways we have tried to do it is just by having sheer numbers at a leadership level who act as role models, who work differently. So we have 4 different business units, 4 different product lines. Our largest product line or business unit is headed by a woman. Our biggest product line is headed by a woman. Okay? Mother of 2, she has everything that all women have. She has a fabulous career. She figures out her schedule. She is not afraid to say, when my daughter's exam is there, this is how I'm going to work. And you start to normalize that, right? And so people look at it and say, if she can do it, I think it's okay for me to do it. And listen, the organization is, you are the organization at that level, right? So you set some of those. So that is one of the biggest reasons why you need to have women in influential positions and decision-making positions, where you have the ability to influence how work happens, and there's not just a single way of working that kind of becomes the organizational way. So I do see it changing.
Yeah, can I add to that a couple of 3 questions? I think I call it the caregiving albatross. I mean, I think the fact is that there are 29 times more women take sort of, sabbaticals in service of others, right? So I think the way companies can do it is monetize parent giving. I mean, what are we going to do with civilization? We all know that women, if they choose, is when, children can come into the world. I don't think it's a new fact that is a surprise. So I think we have to monetize caregiving and parent giving, and things like returnship programs really help. And when men take sabbaticals, and they do, it's always for either entrepreneurship or higher education, both of which are seemingly much more monetizable on their CV. So I think we have to find a way to monetize, feel like they're monetizing. And I think the thing that, somebody's talking about, fascinating data that surprised by bias too. One, and we can start seeing even women in roles of leadership in corporate India are disproportionately mothers. So in fact, we question that to say, oh my God, do mothers actually have a leadership advantage? And is that some sort of patriarchy to say that, you trust senior women, who are mothers? I don't know. These are all the really cool things that we're trying to find out. But because the trope otherwise is, hey, you can't have it all. So if you choose to want to have a family, your career, but we actually found completely counterintuitive data to say all the CXO women that we interviewed actually were mothers, which was really interesting. And the second, and I think the one that we found recently in this report was, and there were a list of options about what do you care about most in your career, from your career. It was career advancement, compensation, and purposeful work were the top 3, with career advancement and compensation number 1 and 2. And all of the options of remote, hybrid, all of that were much lower. So that's what anybody wants. So I think I'd ask first, I think people who are in acceleration, I think the greater tragedy to me is ambitious women with potential not making it. So we can't start with everyone in our companies and in our teams, but I think if you know that there are 2 ambitious women, just take charge of them. And I think that conversation has to shift to team managers, and because I think HR is being personalized more than being standardized. So start with the ones who do want to accelerate and ask them, and if they do, then remove some of the obstacles, is I think the practical way to do it, which has been my learning, and not to fix everything for everyone because I'm going to change everyone in my company and the careers of all women. That's not possible, but start with at least, that's this easy tip.
I'm going to just take a quick stab at the caregiving one because it's a pet topic. I think the problem is we see mothers, we don't see fathers, right? As companies, you try and you think that you have to accommodate mothers and all of these things. I mean, children also have, some children also have other parents. And so I think speaking as a single parent, so therefore I'm so I think the larger point is parental leave, right? There's a really cool article from South Korea, happy to share it with you. But it talks about how companies have opt-out policies for parental leave for men. Right? You have to justify why you don't want parental leave at this point in time. And having worked at and that seems to be really working for multiple things, including women in the workforce, right? In those companies. So that's one. The second, I think, having worked, I mean, relatedly, if you don't have that opt-out, and therefore I think like figuring out the mechanisms, I think we can have lots of innovation and lots of interesting, I mean, there's not a single good practice that we don't find in this in the world that we work in trying to solve for this, right? But what's the mechanism that you're trying to actually fix and unlock is where the devil, lies in those details and the fun. So having worked in a workplace where parental leave was available, but it was optional for, I mean, you had to opt in, we had data that showed that actually all junior women took it, no senior men took it, and they were emails coming that, hey, I have my wife is a homemaker, so I'm okay to, I came back in 3 days or whatever, right? So the insecurity about your role, all of that is very shared. But then if companies and employers don't make the right solutions to actually, understand the problem statement and unlock the right mechanism, it's not going to work. So
I don't know why we are hesitating to acknowledge the elephant in the room. World and organizations become it's a boys' club. And I think somewhere what organizations can do is also normalizing that men can have responsibilities outside career. And by the way, that responsibility doesn't only have to be children. I'm all for and I think many of us here have lived through that cycle of that, your career is priming and you're worried about, oh, but am I too late to have my first kid? And if I delay it any further, will I ever have two? But somewhere the normalizing that a man can also need personal time off, whether it's in terms of parental duties. And I think a big part of we spoke about, what we learned from COVID. It did make that mental and physical workload that women carry to their workplace more visible. For the first time, at least, the men at home realized that if it's a double career couple, that both of them have to do the same amount of Zoom calls, but there's somebody else who's taking care of all household responsibilities. And I'm just saying, Tarun, I love the fact that, we want to raise the question of what role can organizations play on these societal norms. But I'm saying that a lot of it also comes from, we're talking about so much norming about women, and it's okay to take time off, and I should feel confident about coming back and asking for, adjustments. I need to work from home because my kid has an exam. Is it normal for a guy to also ask for the same thing? That, by the way, my wife has an important, or actually, let me correct myself on that. The guy should not need to explain why he needs to take time off because it's the child's exam. And I think somewhere we don't realize, subconsciously, we carry these patriarchal norms. We were all raised with it. These become social acceptances. But my genuine appeal to all the men in the room is to just be more conscious of those boy club norms that we just accept and function under. And that's where societal norms will not change until those norms within organization and professional conversations start switching.
Social change is just feeling impossible, right? That, hey, we are trying to do social change through organizations or hey, what else can, but we're not willing or not thinking about, hey, no, how does the social change happen so that it can lead the path for, even this problem has become a problem because female labor force participation is a challenge and not the unequal duties, right? So I feel like, to me, that's a much larger elephant in the room that just seems beyond us. We're not even willing to question it or challenge it that, acha, social norms badal bhi sakte hain kya, right? And I am a reasonably guilty party to it, but at least the feeling I was left with, and yeah, question to the panel, or if any of you have reflections on it, that, hey, how do you feel about it? Because whether it is education leading to, okay, in education there are a lot of girls, but then moment social responsibilities come in, family responsibilities come in, that wins over workforce, right? Or the conversation we are having now, or the question Tarun is asking, it's like, hey, this feels very hard to change. Can we get levers from elsewhere, right? And
make it. I was just going to say, make it. We are going to be here forever, seriously, because this just goes after my heart, right? I have a daughter, and one of the things I'm passionate about is things have to change for her generation, right? And part of everything that we're trying to do is we are in positions of influence where we all can change. All of us sitting around this room. If we don't do it, then who will do it, right? So part of all of this is making sure that the future generations have it much easier, and that goes back to the societal thing. So two things, besides Act for Women, what I'm passionate about is actually working at a school level. Because a lot of this, if you go back to the school education, is actually ingrained in it. Why does my daughter go for SUPW whereas the boys go for basketball? Right? Very old world thinking. But it's kind of, perpetuating some of that, right? But coming back to the workplace, which is where we all have influence over. I wish I did, but I don't have over that much of the society. But I'll give you a live example. When you come into the workplace and you actually see that the gender roles are much more equal, they are becoming much more equal. You have a woman boss, right? It really changes perspective for many. Okay, I had one of my colleague's wife who came for something that we had, and she said, my husband is now so much more different. He participates in the school PTA, because what we do is we encourage them to bring their kids, because women have, they hesitate about, who will I leave my kids with, all of that stuff. So we actually encourage them to bring them into the office. Yeah, there's a play area, let them play. So if they have school holidays, you don't have to. Men also do that. So now we are finding that men actually are participating a lot more. And I think over time, as they see this equality in the workplace, some of it will spill over to the society. So it's a chicken and an egg. Does the society influence workplace? Does workplace influence society? I do think all of this has spillover effects on how they think, act, and behave differently at home. Hopefully it will be much more, but I think it's got to be a slow process.
Thank you, Shaveta, Shreyasi, Apurva, Suman, Yamini. Thank you, everyone.